What's the funniest thing about Gen X?
How we followed in the pathway of the baby boomers and being very dutiful. You know, the Gen Xer, I mean, they were originally called the latchkey kids or the slackers generation, grunge music and all of that defining the early years of the Gen Xer. And yet it turns out that the Gen Xers in middle age are very mild and responsible parents and paying their taxes and paying down a mortgage.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we put aside talk of culture war or all the stuff we seem to disagree about and talk about the human longings and experiences we all share that make up the mystery of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. Well, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. A time that seems like a universe away now. Now, this was a period that we look back on with maybe nostalgia, or if you're a young person, perhaps mild amusement. It was, of course, a time of LPs and cassette tapes and terrible fashion, and well before mobile phones, the internet, power steering in cars, and more than 4 channels on TV. The speed of change has been astonishing, especially in recent years. And because of this, social research has become so important as we try to make sense of change, think about where we're headed, and try to be wise in how we interact with each other. Mark McCrindle is a social researcher and demographer who's been studying Australian life for 20 years. He and his team have gathered important insights into who we are, what we love, how we have changed, and how we've stayed the same. Also, where we find meaning, purpose, and joy. And as you'll discover today, that might not be quite what you think. One of the things Mark has focused on is generations and the characteristics that are typical of each generation and mark them out as distinct. It's all endlessly fascinating. Mark McCrindle is the founder and CEO of McCrindle Research. He came into the CPX studio and I began our discussion by asking him what have been the most surprising changes he's observed over the time he's been doing this work.
Probably what's surprising is how consistently generational differences play out. You know, in a lot of people's minds, it sounds like it's a little bit of a fad. It's a bit of pop psychology. Putting people into generations sounds a little bit contrived. But the remarkable thing over 20 years of analysis now, in almost any survey, whatever you're looking at, is that when you get the results back and you filter by generation, you get a stepped approach. It might be, younger generations are more likely than older or less likely or whatever it might be. But the consistency across generational analysis as a filter is phenomenal and probably more defining than almost any other characteristic you can look at, such as gender or socioeconomics or culture or whatever. It's quite remarkable. And I think that's because it's multifactorial. It's age, and that defines a lot of us, but it's also the times that shaped us. Growing up in the 80s is different to growing up in the early 2000s. And it also probably reflects the technologies, the events, the social markers that also shaped the formative years of each cohort. So, yeah, that's probably been a big surprise I wasn't expecting when I began.
So what do you most like about the work? What makes it so interesting?
Well, I've always had a fascination with people. I studied psychology. That was my background because I thought I wanted to work in that field, but preferred more the social psychology. What's fascinating is not only how individuals think, but how groups and societies think, and how you end up with a social fabric, how you have community difference and cohesion, and how groups make decisions, and how you see that sentiment change over time. All of those dynamics I find very fascinating, and that's probably why I got into this field.
Do people resist? You said people say, millennials, you're all like this, or Gen Z, or whatever. Do people resist that sort of categorization, or do they mostly just find it kind of reflective of who they are and their friends are or whatever?
There is a little bit of resistance, I think, firstly, because it's natural to say, as you talk about younger people, say, well, I was like that myself. And there's a sense to which that's true, because part of what defines younger generations is being young. And that therefore means we're a little like that ourselves. Probably also there can be a resistance because people can immediately think of someone who doesn't fit that particular characteristic of that generation. Yeah. And so that can cause resistance. But in some ways, when you've got a standout difference. It almost highlights the reality that the broader trend is sustained. And generally, people do see themselves in those generational assessments, and they also see how their generation is different to the one that went before. And I think that reinforces the point that we are a society amidst change.
Yeah. Now, Mark, I'm Gen X.
So am
I think
I.
you might be too.
That's right.
What's the funniest thing about Gen X?
How we followed in the pathway of the baby boomers and being very dutiful. You know, the Gen Xer, I mean, Douglas Copeland, who coined the term back in 91 of his book by the same name, he said, we're not like the ones that went before those baby boomers. Call us X. You know, we defy our label, you know. And, you know, the Gen X, they were originally called the latchkey kids or the slackers generation. The baby busters was a term because we went from the boomers to the busters, recession of early 90s, all of that stuff. And grunge music and all of that defining the early years of the Gen Xer. And yet it turns out that the Gen Xers in middle age are very mild and responsible parents and paying their taxes and paying down a mortgage.
Not as rebellious as we thought, perhaps.
Yes.
It's interesting. I was at a dinner party the other night and everyone was talking about their Spotify rap. And your age, do you want to know what mine was?
Yes.
It's 25.
Oh, right.
So I don't know. I'm listening. My kids, I think, are university age, so they're helping me with this age. But the guy sitting next to me, who's 24, his Spotify age was 73. So what's going on there is that there's a bit of return to the nostalgia of the 60s music, this sort of stuff I think was there.
Yes.
Do you see this in your
definitely.
research?
You know, retro is always a thing. And not just in the type of music we listen to, or for that matter, even the format. You know, vinyl is back, cassette tapes are doing a thing.
Really?
There's an analogs come back.
Shouldn't have thrown mine out.
That's right. It's sort of the anti-digital everything on the phone. People want that. But it's part of a broader trend. There are always trends and then there are counter trends. You know, they're heading in one direction and sometimes that's an overreach and therefore there's a correction, there's a shift back. And it probably is true of a broader perspective, and that is that humans have timeless drivers and needs. And it doesn't matter how much we change, there's often a reversion back to the core attitudes and expectations and timeless desires of the human experience, and that's unchanged through history. So it's inevitable that things will move in a direction, but that history repeats itself.
Well, in funny ways too, isn't it, sometimes? Mark, tell us about the way the Australian population's evolving. Now, I understand, for instance, that I think it's around 28% of Australians are born overseas. I think that's right. What are some other interesting ones?
Yeah, well, that's right. And that cultural diversity and with it, you know, linguistic diversity defines the modern Australian demographic. We're an aging population, partly because we're living longer, which is quite remarkable that this life expectancy forecast at birth continues to creep up, which is, you know, quite remarkable. And that's defining...
Promising.
Yeah, there's hope. But not just living longer, people active later, people working later in life. You know, this idea of sort of a set retirement age, we're seeing that be pushed back because people can work later and they want to work later. And it's a key form of social connection. And plus in a knowledge economy rather than a manual economy, you can physically work a little later because it's not as physical in that traditional sense of labour. But with that, we have also the lowest birth rate ever recorded in our nation. And that's adding to this ageing profile. We've got changes in terms of how we view life and life stage. So the average age of getting married has never been older. The average age of first-time parents has never been older. Those milestones of starting families, of coupling, of getting a house, and even starting full-time employment has all been pushed back, this extension of adolescence. So the redefining of life stage from the old to the young is quite remarkable.
I know you're probably meant to be just objective about all these things, but what do you find interesting about that shift, the pushback, the extension of adolescence? There's probably some good parts to that. Are there some negative aspects to it too, do you think?
There are, because we know that in tough times, it creates a fortitude and a character and a resilience. And when times aren't as tough, and every generation has tough times, and economically things are very tough for young people, but in other ways, people are really tuned into mental health and well-being and supporting young people, and appropriately so. But one of the downsides and an unintended consequence of schools and parents and society really wanting to make sure we're looking after our young people is that we can offer that support, again, for the best of reasons, and they're on this educational conveyor belt longer, they're staying at home longer, they're financially supported longer, and again, really tuned into how you're going, are you okay? That it can almost create a cushion and therefore they're not forced to develop some of that resilience, some of the consequences of behaviour, some of the realities, that the tough love that comes through sometimes mistakes and doing it on your own. If we institutionalize adolescence, that it stays longer, then they don't move to independence, which is really the goal, from dependence of childhood to independence of adulthood, and we're pushing that back a little to their detriment.
At the other end of the scale, the ageing population you mentioned, some big challenges with that too, isn't it? Just being able to sustain that medically and so on.
Exactly. And that's why, firstly, from a carer perspective, the caring economy is so big, because we've got more older people looking for care, and, AI is not going to bring a solution to the human-centered care. And we have expectations now. I mean, older people, of course, have expectations of how they want their older years to live. People want to age in place. They want services to come to them. They have a higher expectation of mobility and access to services for longer, and of course that's appropriate, but getting the staffing on that is key, and that brings us to the economic challenge of an ageing profile. I mean, it's a good news story to have ageing, but if you've got a higher proportion of the population outside of the tax-paying years and a lower proportion with record low birth rates in the tax-paying years over time, and of course the expenses of an older profile, as healthcare, pension costs, aged care costs are greater, we end up with these structural budget deficits. And therefore, how do you spread the cost of an increasingly expensive society across a smaller taxpayer base? That's the conundrum that governments are dealing with.
What are the reasons for the lower birth rate? I guess it's a very complex question, but do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, it starts with the economics. So all of our research of young couples say, well, look, it's expensive to have children, and so we want to get a financial stable nest together. The nesting is a prerequisite for childbirth. It's quite remarkable that almost 9 in 10 couples in Australia cohabitate prior to marriage. But the majority of children, almost 2/3 of children, are born nuptially to married parents. So at some point, couples are happy to live together without marriage. But when they think about starting a family, that's when they say, we're going to get married here. And particularly for women who need and expect the security of that, they're at the most vulnerable with a young one. And so the old, that we might think are quaint values, actually turn out to be, for modern Australian women, core, that they want marriage before the children. And what goes often along with that is wanting stability of household as well, a stability of a housing, and therefore they don't want to rent, they want to own. And so all of that, therefore, comes at a little later age because it's expensive, or there's the need to get things stable relationally. And so marriage has now shifted in a little over 50 years from an early 20-something phenomenon to now an early 30-something. And so it is with childbirth. A woman nearly 32, the median age of giving birth for the first time. So we end up starting families later, and fewer children because of the economics, but also just because of the biological realities. There are many that would have wanted more, but time and cost mean that they're having fewer. If we look at why we have fewer children, it's not that there's an increase in the number of women remaining childless. That's consistently been about 1 in 4. There's a very slight increase. It's more the women who are having 4 are having 3, and those who are having 3 are having 2. In fact, a lot more having 1. So it all comes back to the economics and the impact that has on life stage.
I want to ask you about loneliness. We hear about a loneliness epidemic. Is that reflected in your research?
It is. It's a big factor. I mean, firstly, you've got a quarter of all households nationally are solo person households.
Right.
It's one of the biggest housing types. I mean, family type is slightly larger. Now, it might give this impression that every fourth house you pass just has a single person. It's skewed because of the ageing profile. So every older person as an individual household, even if they're in an institutional setting, is counted as a solo household for the purposes of demographics. But it does highlight a broader factor. It's not just age. You've got a lot of people that are solo as they move through the dynamics of life and relationships, and particularly young men in that situation, and young people moving out of a parental home but marrying a lot later or coupling up a lot later. So all of these dynamics around the life stages lead to periods of increased loneliness in people's lives.
And we do hear that young people are especially lonely. Is that the case?
Yes, it is. And, it's not just their living situation. They're living at home longer. In fact, the median age of leaving home is now just shy of 26 years of age. So this idea that, Yeah, you hit sort of 19, 20, you get a job and move out. That marker of adulthood, that
My kids are still there. That's good. I mean, I like it.
pace yourself, Simon. It's,
I've got a few more years to go.
That's right. And that's a lovely thing. You know, it does, you're talking about the Spotify profiles, it does keep us all a bit young because we're connected with the early 20-something kids and their friends. But it can, as they do finally move out, they're not in that situation of starting their own families, so they move from a family situation to a solo or a group situation, and onset of loneliness can be there.
Do they report being lonely because why are they feeling lonely though?
Well, I mean, another key factor is, ironically named social media. It's not particularly social. You know, it's back to that point earlier that humans are really timeless in their needs, in how they're created and in what they look for in life. And if we try to short circuit things, if we try to cram things or find a new solution, it often isn't in a lasting way satisfying. And I think the digital in all areas is an example of that. We did a little bit of analysis most recently in online dating and found now there's a generation of young people that are pushing back on that because they found it so transactional. You know, it's not like mass searching for an Amazon item at the cheapest price. It's not like finding the latest car on car sales or whatever. For organic things, for human things like relationships that just need to develop often through nuance and unexpected ways, it can become very transactional. And that's why, without any sense of comparing with how it used to be, you've just got a generation saying, I just don't know why, but I'm not finding that satisfying. And so they're pushing away from that. And I think in our broader relationships, that's also the case. That we did some research into social media. We found that the majority of Australians in their social media content from a relational perspective are consumers, not contributors. So they're downloading what others are doing. They can wax lyrical about what all their friends are doing, but they're not actually connecting with them or sharing something of their own life for that matter. And so again, it's not true relationship. It's not genuine social if it's just seeing what other people are doing, and therefore little surprise there's a problem with it.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with social researcher and demographer Mark McCrindle. In this part of the interview, we'll get into shifts in Australia in attitudes to faith and the church, and how open people are to spiritual conversations and where they look for meaning. But at first, having discussed the issue of loneliness, I wanted to talk to Mark about community and how well we are doing with that, and how community is changing. Here's Mark again.
Yeah, well, it's undergoing a little bit of a resurgence. It's amazing in all these things to find challenges, but to find spots of hope.
Yeah.
And the pandemic, changed a lot of things, but some things for the good. And what it did is reconnected Australians with their locale. We thought for a while as Australians that where we live doesn't matter. That can be like the dormitory, and we head to where the life is, in the city where our work is, or around other places that we connect. But it turns out that we are actually beings that need to connect where we're planted and where we spend our residential time. And so what the pandemic did was decoupled, firstly, work from location, and so people could work from home. And that meant they spent more time there. And then suddenly they realized, well, I probably want to shop and connect a bit more locally as well. And everything from the local gyms to the local bakers and the local cafes did really well. And a lot of that has been maintained. Some of it at the detriment of the CBD, setups that we had close to where everyone would come in to the workplace. But it did offer some vibrancy in the suburbs. The fastest growing retail connection point has been the local shopping strip, not those big destination shopping centres. And all of that, I think, is very flourishing for local community. And so that's been a bright spot in all of this. People reconnecting local, walking the dog locally, getting to know neighbours, joining the local run club or reading club, or connecting up even with that local library and local services. So that's been a real positive that's come in the last few years.
Yeah, I hear run clubs are booming, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, exactly. And I think that's the thing. It's community with purpose. That's what people want. A community that has a reason for gathering, but still it's community as a byproduct, for some indeed the prime product. And workplaces can be that, traditionally have been that. We're not friends just because we've chosen each other. We're friends because of our purpose of work here. But people found that maybe work was becoming just too much focused on the task, not enough on the relational. And so the particularly emerging generation started to disconnect there and realize for healthy relationships, we need social connections beyond work, and run clubs are one of those.
So speaking of community now, I want to ask you about churches. Now, church is not the first thing that a lot of people think of when they think of community, but are people going to church anymore? And at their best, what do churches provide in terms of community?
Yeah. Well, people in our research, we asked this very question, Simon, do have warmth towards the local churches in their area. Now, many have never darkened the door of the church, but they see what's going on. They just like they see what's happening with the local shopping strip or other things, because they're invested locally and they care about it and they keep an eye on it. And what we found in the research is Australians have question marks about institutional religion. And for that matter, even the institutional church, whatever that might mean. But if you talk about the church in Australia, people start to get a little bit concerned, that maybe
their eyes glaze over, but they might also be a little bit, have some resentment.
Exactly. A church is lobbying for this and that. Do churches still have institutional power? Australians, they're not just anti-institutional church, they're anti any institution, right, whether they be political or banks or insurance companies or whatever might have a sense of power out there. But what's interesting is if you ask them about what about the local church in your place? What about the place up the road? Oh, no, they do great things in my community. There's great warmth. The majority of Australians like their local church. They're just not quite sure about institutional Christianity. Yeah. And I just find that fascinating, because what is institutional Christianity if not just the individuals coming together and indeed, these local churches trying to connect. But I think that's a good news story, that they do see churches without any sense of cynicism or contempt when they're local in their area as doing good things for the community.
What are those things when they're doing them well?
Well, if you ask Australians what they do well, they believe that local churches do reach out to their community. They see some of the different programs, whether it be kids clubs and gathering points for young people, and certainly a good amount of care for the community, those doing it tough with food hampers and other things. And they put on programs at different times of year and invite the community along. So there's a sense that churches, far from being exclusive, are actually open and wanting people to come along, advertising on the front hoarding, different events and all are welcome. So they have that sense. They probably don't see the Christianity side of it as much in terms of what the church is preaching, and maybe they themselves don't feel perhaps a need for that. But they certainly see the outward focus, the outreach of the churches, and are very positive towards it.
Australians have always had this sort of uncomfortable relationship with religion and been a little bit wary of it. I think that's been the case since settlement. It remains the case now. But there's some interesting things going on. You've done a report, your organisation's done a report called Undercurrents of Faith. First of all, why that title?
Because we're well aware of the main current that we see, the big flow, and that is people out of Christianity. And that is most noted by the census data, which in a 10-year period has shown total number of Australians identifying their religion as Christianity has gone from 61% to 44% across 3 census periods.
There's a big drop, isn't it?
That's significant. And it seems as if it's a one-way street, and you could read into that to say, well, therefore, it's just a matter of time before Christianity, well, it's already in minority, it dissipates to not much at all, and that seems to be its future. But there are undercurrents. There are things below the current, like you're a surfer, Simon, that there might be a tide or a wave, but there's often an underpool that's hard to pick, and it can be quite strong. And that's why we called it an undercurrent of faith, because firstly, while that census data is there, we looked at the longitudinal census analysis census data set, which looks at individual census forms. They're all de-identified, but it can track forms like people in a household and what they said this year and what they said 5 years prior. Yeah. And what's interesting is that over that same period of time, the 5-year census periods, you've had, for example, the last 5-year period, 800,000 that 5 years earlier said no religion and most recently said Christianity as their religion. So we've got these massive groupings, as I said, that main current moving away from Christianity, but this undercurrent of massive groupings, indeed hundreds of thousands moving to Christianity as well. So that's part of it. And just this openness to explore faith was another big aspect that we found.
What do you think were the most surprising aspects of that report?
Well, the growth amidst decline in identification with Christianity, the growth in an openness to explore Christianity. So in 15 years, the proportion of people saying, I'm open to exploring things of a faith or worldview different to my own, has more than doubled. Now you've got 1 in 5 Australians that say, I'm extremely or very open to exploring the things of faith or worldview beyond my own current perspective. And it's even higher for young people. In fact, just over half of all young people say they're extremely or very open. So we sometimes think that people are closed to Christianity or religion in Australia, particularly young people, probably aren't interested in those antiquated thoughts. But actually, it's the opposite. They don't even know much about Christianity with which to reject it. They're in some ways pre-Christian, in many, pre-religion. And therefore, they're open, like, I'm happy to hear, what is this thing? So amidst this apparent decline in Christianity is an increasing openness to explore these things, particularly amongst young people. And indeed, and this is quite remarkable, 1 in 3 said, when we asked if you were invited to attend a church or Christian event by a friend or family member, how likely would you be to attend? And 1 in 3 said extremely or very likely. That's 1 in 3 Australians. Now, not just by a random, we said family or friend, but still, this big openness to even attend church if invited or a Christian event does, again, show an interest out there.
What are the differences in the generations? You do a lot of work on the generations. When it comes to this topic, is it boomers who were the first ones to kind of really reject institutional religion? Is that still the case? What happens with Gen X? What goes on there?
Yeah, that's right. If we think about the baby boomers who are now, well into their 70s at the oldest edge, if we go back in time when they were, half a century ago in their younger years, there was a lot of social revolution. Women's liberation and pushback on institutionalism generally, political change, and indeed more of a focus on social justice and freedoms. And so it was deemed that Christianity was part of the problem, and there was pushback on that, and a generation who turned their back on indeed what their parents or the previous generation had held sacred. And to an extent, the Gen X has continued in that, but obviously the impetus of that declines as the what's in changes. And so now we have a generation that actually, if you want to be a rebel, if you want to push back on society, you're probably someone who goes to church or looks up Christianity because it's at a lower ebb. And so there's not as much to push back on in that regard.
You're more edgy if you start checking out Christian faith or church. Now, Mark, I've been known to say, and I'm just going to check because I've got you here, is this true? I'll have to repent of this if it isn't. I've sometimes said to people, there are more people who go to church on a Sunday than all the footy code crowds combined. Am I right?
You're exactly right. And we've done the numbers on that. So it currently sits at 1 in 5 Australians once a month, so not every week, and that includes online church, but these are regular churchgoers, attend a church in all their forms, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, all those different denominations. But that is a massive grouping. And if we think about Australia, that's just under 5 million people on any given Sunday, which is far over a month, which is far larger than the total crowds attending, even in season, AFL plus NRL plus the A-League. They've still got a few supporters, and Super Rugby and other things. You add them all up, and your statement is correct. Over a month, more Australians find themselves in churches in their various forms than even the great religion of sport.
I was probably quoting you when I said it, I guess. I'd forgotten, but good to have that confirmed. So thank you. We hear about some prominent conversions to Christianity, some quite influential people, and some theorists are saying they feel like, the tide of secularism may have reached its furthest point and might start to come back. And in the UK, there's some interesting signs of that, with young people especially going to church. They've had a big uplift in numbers of people going to church, and they're starting from a pretty low base, admittedly, but there's been this sort of shift. What do you make of this? Are you thinking this is a thing? Do you think it's a bit overblown? What's your sense of it?
There are some signals that it's a thing even here in Australia. And again, because you've got trends and counter-trends, and things can get so secular that actually to look at the alternative becomes an inevitable counter-trend. People say that, we're post-Christian. In a lot of ways, people are post-materialist. They're post-capitalism. They're post the Aussie dream. They're post-secularism because the promises of secularism have not delivered. And there's a lot of angst and uncertainty out there, and the deeper needs of the soul and the psyche haven't been met through modern, liberal, capitalist society. And so, a little surprised to see people are exploring. And one of our undercurrents of faith was older people returning to the Christian faith. It was quite remarkable.
That was surprising.
And we think, well, the older you are, the more hardened you are in your views. But if we think about the baby boomers again, they were the most likely to have had some early Christian experience. Maybe they were forced to go to Sunday school, or they used to go to Mass, or they were at a religious school, and that was just the done thing once a term, and they resisted it, but they had it. And as you get older, and maybe it's when the grandkids comes along, maybe it's when frailty onsets or there's a health scare, and you start to think about the latter end, and you start to think about the future. And many of them go back to those seeds of faith that they maybe resisted in the past, but reflect on once more. And so certainly there is this resurgence or this undercurrent, this flow back of older people, while the younger ones are exploring some interest and openness. So I think there's enough signals there to say that, there is a deeper search for meaning in Australia currently.
Now, Mark, a little bit of your work involves crystal ball gazing. What do you anticipate to be the big social changes in the next, let's say, 5 years in Australia? And are my kids going to be able to buy a house?
Yeah, well, the big economic one, I think, is going to remain challenging because, quite simply, the demand for housing is outstripping the supply. There's one ironclad law of housing policy in Australia, and that is we always overshoot the growth targets in population through particularly migration. We always undershoot how many homes we're going to build, and that is the case once more. And we are a culture that does like to own, not just long-term rents, and that seems to be baked into the Australian psyche and way of life. So unfortunately, those costs are just there. There's a paring back of some of the growth trends around migration. There's impetus to build more homes, but we're just not meeting the gap there. On the other broader trends, what's remarkable, we just finished an analysis looking at what the emerging trends are for the year ahead, and even though the economic issues are front of mind, housing, cost of living, stubborn interest rates and inflation that doesn't seem to be declining very much. In any survey we run, what are you most concerned about? We've got this big focus on the economics. However, when we said, what are you most focused on as you think about the 3 years ahead, it wasn't at all the economics. That fell down the list. It was about relational well-being. It was about deeper connection. It was about ensuring that their well-being, in a broader, not mental well-being, of course, but physical health and relational health was squared away. And I found that quite interesting because you would think that if economics are so front of mind, if people are feeling the pain of that, then that's going to be the focus. But it's almost as if, and it flowed through in another one we looked at around work, we said, well, what sort of job are you looking for? People weren't focused on the highest pay or the most secure employment. They're actually focusing on work that could facilitate some of those broader goals of well-being, of work-life balance, of working where I feel I'm making a difference and where I feel connected. So that's a big one. Australians are saying, look, as much as we've tried in these recent years to get the household budget under a fit place, we can't, or we still are struggling. Therefore, maybe we need to set that to the side as a focus and just make sure we're travelling well and we're doing well.
So there's more to us than our economics.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's true. Mark, it's so interesting talking about this fascinating stuff. You do it so well and make it so accessible. So thank you for coming and talking about this today on Life and Faith. It's been great to have you.
Oh, thanks, Simon. It's been fun.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. Thanks to Mark McCrindle for sharing his insights with us today. You can check out Mark's work and that of his team, reports and books at mccrindle.com.au, where you can see what they do in helping understand the culture more, make better decisions based on that understanding, and think in a more informed way about the future. I'll put a link in the notes to all that. Thank you to our producer, someone who transcends generations and defies categorization, Alan Douthwaite. And thanks for your company. Next time.
The history of my life really is what makes me me, and not just some creature or organism experiencing a bunch of random chaotic events in life. I come to know myself and others and the world around me by putting those discrete events into a narrative that I assume has some sort of purpose or direction or meaning. And in fact, most of my life, and I think any of our lives, is trying to figure that out. How do all those discrete events connect to each other? And how am I going to make sense of the various things that I encountered?